Voss leaned into the massive frame of the beast, his lips inches from a jaw that could crush a transport hull. He didn't flinch as the Gore Hulk's hot, carnivorous breath ruffled his hair. Instead, he whispered. The sound was a low, vibrational thrum that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the marrow. The monster, a 3-ton engine of slaughter, stopped its rampage instantly. Its pupils dilated, and it let out a soft, whistling sigh, leaning its heavy forehead into the palm of the technician's grease-stained hand. The deadliest predator is the one who chooses not to bite, and Alara, watching from the safety of the mezzanine, realized she had no idea which of them that sentence described. 6 hours ago, Voss had been nothing more than a smudge on her itinerary. Sovereign Alara had arrived at the Zenith Spire expecting the clinical perfection of the Celestinite hegemony. Instead, she found a human slumped in the corridors of the High Command, his jumpsuit stained with lubricants and his boots leaving dull marks on the pristine floors. "Get that thing out of my sight," Alara had said, pointing a gloved finger at Voss without looking him in the eye. To her, he was just another Terrasol contractor, a short-lived creature from a primitive system brought in to handle the manual labor the hegemony found beneath them. Their kind was known for their persistence, but they were messy, loud, and entirely too carbon-based for her liking. Voss hadn't looked offended. He'd simply looked up from his datapad, his eyes sharp and unnervingly observant. "The primary atmospheric scrubbers are cycling at 80% efficiency, Sovereign. If I don't balance the pressure now, the Spire's going to start whistling like a tea kettle by sunset. Then fix it quietly," she snapped, turning her back on him, "and do it away from the diplomatic wings." Ironically, she'd forgotten he existed until the alarm started screaming. The Gore Hulk was a biological horror, a creature of pure instinct and fury meant for the border wars. It had broken its tether in the lower labs, carving through titanium bulkheads as if they were wet paper. By the time Alara reached the observation deck, the Spire's elite Praetorians were already retreating, their pulse rifles doing nothing but fueling the beast's rage. Then came the presence of a master hiding in the grease of a wrench. Voss had simply walked into the chamber. He didn't have armor. He didn't have a weapon. He just had that unsettling, steady gaze. He'd moved through the chaos like he was walking through a garden, ignoring the shouts of the dying and the thunder of the Hulk's fists. When he spoke that ancient, rattling tongue, the air in the room seemed to thicken. It was a bridge built from the wreckage of underestimated potential. Alara felt the weight of her own ignorance pressing down on her. A technician didn't learn the dialect of the deep void predators in a Terrasol trade school. A messy apprentice didn't stand before a god of anger and make it bow. "Who are you?" she whispered to the empty air of the mezzanine, her suspicion turning into a cold, hard knot of dread. Voss didn't look up. He just patted the monster's flank and pointed it back toward the holding pen. But as he turned to leave, he caught Alara's gaze for a fraction of a second. There was no subservience in his eyes. There was only the calm, terrifying patience of a man who knew exactly how the world worked, and exactly how much he was holding back. The air in the Spire didn't just vibrate, it shattered. The insurgents didn't come with a formal declaration. They came with a thermal charge that turned the northern docking bay into a throat of fire. Within seconds, the hegemony's polished paradise was a slaughterhouse. Alara found herself pressed against a cold crystalline wall, the heat of the nearby explosions searing the air she breathed. Her Praetorians, the supposed apex warriors of the galaxy, were being dismantled by a coordinated strike they never saw coming. Then, through the haze of smoke and the scream of depressurizing corridors, she saw him. Voss wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was standing in the center of the command hub, his grease-stained jumpsuit a jagged contrast to the gold-trimmed uniforms of the dying officers. He had a headset on, his fingers dancing across a terminal with a speed that suggested he wasn't just fixing the atmospheric scrubbers. He was rewriting the Spire's entire tactical grid. "Formation Delta 4, Voss said, his voice cutting through the panic like a blade. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. "Shield bearers, drop to the lower hip. Let them think the line is breaking. Snipers don't look for the hard look for the cooling vents on their rigs. Hit them on my mark." The Praetorians, men and women who had ignored Voss for months, hesitated for only a heartbeat before the sheer authority in his tone snapped them into place. They moved because they realized, perhaps for the first time, that they were finally listening to someone who knew exactly how the day would end. Alara stumbled toward him, her hands trembling. "Boss, what are you doing? You're a technician." "I'm a man who likes things to work correctly, Sovereign," he replied without looking up. "And right now, your security protocols are broken." He began speaking into the comms again, but the language changed. It wasn't the hegemony's clipped dialect or the rough tongue of Terrasol. It was the ancient, guttural code of the insurgents themselves, the language of the monsters. He was mocking their formations, redirecting their fire, and leading them into a series of structural bottlenecks that turned their numerical advantage into a liability. It was a masterclass in violence intentionally withheld until the absolute final moment. Every move was a bridge built from the wreckage of underestimated potential. He didn't just defeat the insurgents. He dismantled their will to fight before they even realized they'd lost. By the time the last of the borders were neutralized, the silence that followed was heavier than the sound of the cannons. The spire was still standing, but the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Alara watched Voss as he calmly powered down the terminal and began wiping the sweat and carbon scoring from his forehead with a rag that was already ruined. "You led them," Alara said, her voice a hushed realization. "You're not an apprentice, you're not even a specialist. You're the reason the hegemony hasn't collapsed into a dozen civil wars." Voss stopped, the rag frozen against his skin. He finally looked at her, and the mask of the messy human slipped just enough to reveal the cold, terrifying intelligence beneath. "People don't tell the truth to kings, Alara," he said softly. "They don't show their real faces to generals. But the technician, the man who mops the floors and fixes the vents, no one hides from him. I can stop a war before it starts because I'm the only one who hears the gears grinding." He tossed the rag aside and picked up his wrench, the heavy metal clinking against his belt. True authority isn't found in the loudest voice. It's in the capacity for catastrophe that stays in your pocket. He walked past her, heading toward the damaged scrubbers as if he hadn't just saved a civilization. Alara stayed in the center of the hub, watching the man she had dismissed as a smudge on her itinerary. She realized then that the most dangerous weapon in the spire wasn't the Gore Hulk or the Praetorians. It was the man who chose the mask of a servant so he could keep the world from burning. "Wait," she called out, her voice catching. "Why stay like this? You could rule." Voss paused at the airlock, looking back over his shoulder with a small, tired smile. "I've already ruled, Sovereign. It's much more peaceful to be the man who just fixes the tea kettle. Would you like me to generate an image of Kalen Voss in his dual role, half-shadowed tactician and half-wary technician?"